Welcome to the Deep Dive, where our mission really is to cut through that huge ocean of information out there. We want to distill it down into those crucial insights you need to be, well, truly well informed. In a world just awash with data, we aim to give you a real shortcut to understanding. Maybe with a few surprising facts, just enough maybe humor to keep you hooked along the way. Today, we're embarking on a really fascinating deep dive. We've got a collection of analyses all drawn from a single, quite compelling publication. And it's, I think, a powerful testament to how one source can illuminate just an incredible range of global issues. We're talking everything from the ground beneath our feet, the food it yields, all the way to the nuanced, often forgotten history of academic thought. And then the ever-shifting, sometimes pretty stark sands of international geopolitics. So our goal today is to unpack each piece. We'll pull out the most important nuggets of knowledge, the key insights. We'll explore what it all means and, crucially, why it matters directly to you.
Yeah, and what's truly fascinating here, I think, is how these topics, which seem so different on the surface, are actually connected. They're connected by the very act of, well, deep analysis itself. Each piece really forces us and you to consider multiple perspectives on something.
All right, let's dive in then. Let's unpack this first piece, a detailed analysis titled Bountiful Harvests. Now, the headline itself, it immediately brings reasons for cheer, right? It promises good news. The third advance estimates of food grain production. These were released back in May 2025. They show that India's total food grain output has soared by a pretty remarkable 6.5%, which puts it at an 8-year high, 354 million tons for the 2024-25 agricultural year. I mean, that sounds like a bumper harvest by any metric, doesn't it?
It really does.
Especially when you look at the long-term trends. This isn't just a one-off thing. The source highlights consistent growth over the last decade. And impressively, this was achieved despite, erratic monsoons, the increasing challenges of climate, which we hear so much about. 9 consecutive years of increase. That's quite a feat, unmatched until now, the source says. It really paints a picture of, well, agricultural resilience progress. It gives you the sense the nation's breadbasket is truly overflowing.
But if we connect this to the bigger picture, it's actually more complex than just expanding the amount of land being farmed. That's often the first assumption people make, right? More land, more food. But the source meticulously breaks down the drivers. 2 major factors. First, changes in acreage, that's the total area cultivated. And second, perhaps even more significantly, the yield of crops. So how much produce you get per unit of land. And what's particularly reassuring, and maybe points to a more sustainable kind of growth, is that the improvements in productivity, yield per hectare, were almost 3 times faster than the increase in acreage over the last 10 years.
Okay. 3 times faster.
Yeah. So it isn't just about expanding horizontally, spreading out. It's about becoming significantly more efficient in how food is grown. And that kind of intensive growth, getting more out of the land you already have, that's a much stronger indicator, really, of long-term food security and agricultural advancement. But this growth, remarkable as it is, immediately begs an important question. How stable is it? How resilient is this progress, especially with environmental variables, other challenges? Now, while overall acreage, the land cultivated, it was negatively affected in only 3 out of the 10 years.
Only 3.
And even then, only marginally. The extent of the fall was typically less than 2%, but the fluctuations actually varied quite sharply across the major crops. Take wheat, for example, a crucial staple. Its output fell in 5 of those 10 years.
5 out of 10 for wheat.
Right. And Nutricereals and pulses, they saw output dips in 4 years each. Rice was 3 years. However, and this is key, these dips weren't simultaneous. They didn't all happen at once. So the varied timing acted as a kind of natural buffer, stopping a single cumulative negative hit on the overall food grain output.
I see. So one crop's dip might be offset by another's good year.
Exactly. And similarly, if you look at yield per hectare, it only fell once in 10 years for rice, wheat, and Nutricereals, twice for pulses. And even when these minor falls happened, they were modest. They didn't really dent the steady growth in productivity levels, not for total cereals or overall food grains. So what emerges is, well, a picture of an agricultural system that, while individual crops might face some volatility, has developed remarkable stability. And consistent progress at the aggregate level, it's effectively hedging against those localized downturns. But despite this truly remarkable increase in total food grain output, and it has undoubtedly ensured adequate availability for crucial welfare schemes, it's bolstered overall food security despite all that. The source describes the overall macro scenario as, quote, far from encouraging.
Far from encouraging after all that positive news.
Exactly. And this is where the paradox truly hits home. Why, when there's seemingly more food than ever before, are we still facing such significant, persistent challenges? It forces us to look beyond those headline numbers, doesn't it? Delve into the qualitative aspects of food production and consumption.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting. And maybe a bit counterintuitive, like you said.
Yeah.
You'd instinctively think, well, more food means fewer problems. Simple. But the source points to a critical disconnect. It goes beyond just quantity. It's fundamentally about the type of food. The issue isn't just calories. It's about nutrition, about evolving dietary preferences.
Changing needs.
Yeah. Changing consumption trends, nutritional needs. They're demanding a fundamental shift in what we produce. People are moving away, apparently, from just relying on staples like rice and wheat.
Well,
They want more diverse, more nutritious, higher value products, things like pulses, nutricereals, more fruits and vegetables, horticulture, and dairy. But it's precisely in these areas, the high-value, nutrition-rich segments, that supply constraints keep stubbornly popping up. And that directly contributes to inflationary pressures.
Exactly. It's like we're producing a massive surplus of what people used to eat predominantly, but maybe not enough of what they need and want now. And that creates this imbalance that hits both producers and consumers. And this highlights a really significant and honestly persistent policy challenge within the agricultural sector. The current policy regime, especially through things like minimum support prices, procurement policies, it generally weighs heavily in favor of cereals, particularly rice and wheat.
Right, the big staples.
The big staples. And this bias means their acreage, the land dedicated just to them, keeps growing almost unhindered, often at the expense of other potentially more beneficial crops. The numbers are quite stark, actually. They illustrate this imbalance very clearly. Out of the 130 million hectare increase in total food grain acreage over the last decade, a staggering 2/3, that's a massive 86 million hectares, was solely due to increased area under rice and wheat.
Wow, 2/3 just for rice and wheat.
It shows a dominant, almost singular focus, doesn't it? And in stark contrast, the area under much lauded nutricereals, despite their nutritional benefits, their resilience to climate change, growing demand, it's remained almost stagnant during the same period.
Stagnant, huh?
Yeah. The only major breakthrough, the notable exception really, was pulses. They saw a significant 40 million hectare increase. That's about 1/5 of the total increase in acreage. And crucially, pulses accelerated their pace of growth to almost double that of overall food grains, which suggests maybe a successful, albeit perhaps limited, policy shift, or maybe just farmer adaptation in that specific category. But even that success is largely overshadowed by the continued disproportionate dominance of rice and wheat. And this dominance, it isn't just about acreage, it translates directly into the composition of the overall food basket. Despite those marginal changes we just talked about, the composition of food grain output, it's remained almost static over the entire decade. Rice and wheat, they continue to maintain their dominant shares, stubbornly stagnating at over 40% and over 30% respectively.
Still the vast majority.
Absolutely. Nutricereals, despite their importance for diversification for nutrition, they remain stable at slightly less than 1/5 of the total. So consequently, the share of all cereals in total food grain production remains stubbornly stuck at around 93% in 2024-25. That's virtually the same level as a decade earlier in 2014-15.
No real shift then.
Very little. Similarly, pulses, even with their acreage increase, saw their share of total production just hover persistently near the 7% mark during this period. This deep inflexibility in cropping patterns, combined with the growing demand for these high-value, more nutritious crops, well, it leads directly to demand-supply imbalances. And as we know, when demand outstrips supply, it directly contributes to food inflation. It hits household budgets, disproportionately affects vulnerable populations, and it impacts overall economic stability. It's a really vivid illustration that just having quantity alone doesn't solve the deeper problems of food security and nutrition. What's particularly fascinating here, though, and offers some crucial policy insights, are the state-level dynamics. They reveal very different strategies at play across the nation. A major share of food grain production is heavily concentrated, really, in just a few states. Uttar Pradesh, Madhya Pradesh, Punjab, Haryana, and Bihar, together they account for over half the total production.
Over half from just 5 states.
Yeah. And if you expand that slightly, the top 10 states make up almost 4/5 of the entire national food grain output. So that highlights significant regional dependence, a concentration of agricultural power. In the last 5 years specifically, states like Madhya Pradesh, Bihar, and Telangana have driven most of the recent increase. For instance, Madhya Pradesh's share increased by 2.9 percentage points, reaching 12.9% of the national total. Bihar and Telangana also saw their shares rise by 1 and 1.8 percentage points, respectively, each hitting about 5.9%. But what's even more striking is how they achieved this growth.
Right.
While the growth in MP and Telangana was largely driven by an increase in acreage, basically expanding the land under cultivation, Bihar's growth was mainly fueled by growing yields. They're getting significantly more output from the same amount of land.
Different strategies. More land versus more from the same land.
Exactly. It suggests different regional ecosystems, different policy interventions are working. It highlights that maybe a one-size-fits-all policy might not be the most effective approach across the entire country. Tailored approaches might be essential for continued sustainable growth.
So, okay, let's bring it back. What does this all mean for you, our listener? It's clearly much more than just whether there's enough food overall or enough to keep those crucial welfare schemes running. It's fundamentally about what kind of food is being produced and how specific policy choices made today, particularly those that, maybe inadvertently, continue to favor certain staple crops. How those choices might influence your dinner plate, your grocery bill, maybe even the health of your family down the line. It's a powerful reminder, isn't it, that bountiful harvests, while they sound great, don't automatically mean complete food security or optimal nutrition for everyone. The quality, the diversity, the balance of what's produced, that's just as critical, maybe even more so, than the sheer quantity. Understanding these nuances helps you see the hidden challenges behind the headlines. All right, so from the very tangible realities of agriculture and your weekly grocery bill, let's now take a deep dive into a more abstract realm, but one that's equally foundational. We're going to look at the history of academic thought.
Specifically, the fascinating evolution of anthropology and sociology in India. This is based on a compelling editorial from June 2000. In this piece, it really invites us to think about how knowledge itself is created, recorded, interpreted, and sometimes how it even gets forgotten. It sheds light on those intellectual currents that shape our very understanding of society and maybe even ourselves.
Yeah, and this immediately brings up a really important question, doesn't it, about how knowledge itself is constructed and remembered. And critically, whose stories, whose narratives get prioritized in the history books of intellectual thought. The source notes that research into the history of these disciplines, anthropology and sociology, it's been vigorously underway in the Western Academy for decades now. This research often focused on rediscovering their, quote, founding ancestors, painstakingly retracing fieldwork footsteps. It cites influential work by figures like Clifford, Geertz, Marcus, Fisher, Kucklick, Fox, Stocking, Wiener, a whole list. These scholars dug into private diaries. They meticulously read ethnographies against the grain, trying to unearth hidden histories, revealing biases, colonial contexts of early academic work.
Right, trying to understand the context behind the research itself.
Exactly. However, the source points out most of this emphasis has been disproportionately on British and American scholarship. Asia, Africa, Polynesia, the very regions where so much anthropological fieldwork was actually done, where these concepts were tested, they were often reductively seen merely as sites for Western fieldwork, just places to study, rarely, if ever, acknowledged as places with their own rich traditions of scholarship, and, crucially, peopled with active participants who were deeply interested in shaping the discipline too. This created a rather one-sided, you could even say colonial view of intellectual history. Knowledge flowed mainly west to east. So what's truly fascinating here, and represents a vital corrective, is the deliberate push within India to address this, to balance this historical view. While it's undeniably true that sociology and anthropology in India were significantly shaped by Western theories, by scholars like British colonial ethnographers or early European sociologists, the source emphasizes that local, indigenous influences, theoretical, institutional, national, played a major, often overlooked role in their development. An IEG workshop, that's the Institute of Economic Growth, a prominent research institution in India, which is the focus of this piece, aimed precisely to uncover and highlight this indigenous context. It focused specifically on the intricate link between knowledge, institutions, and practices within the very life of these disciplines in India. And this move is critical because it challenges that long-held idea of a one-way flow of knowledge from the West. It asserts, quite unequivocally, that local contexts aren't just passive recipients. They are profoundly active contributors, shapers of global academic discourse, adapting, reinterpreting theories to fit local realities.
Okay, so this wasn't just about abstract theories floating around then. This was about specific places, real people, grounded in tangible institutions.
Absolutely. The workshop located knowledge production, not just in broad theoretical paradigms, but as it was embodied, nurtured in particular academic departments. The source gives concrete examples, the sociology and anthropology departments at Lucknow University or Baroda University, highlighting them as vibrant centers of intellectual activity. It also underscored how these disciplines were pushed forward, given structure, by specific foundational associations, things like the Indian Sociological Society or the Anthropological Survey of India. This really brings the history to life, doesn't it? It shows how intellectual thought isn't just born, it's cultivated, debated, developed within specific, dynamic academic ecosystems. It's a powerful reminder that ideas don't just appear fully formed, they're shaped, fostered by the environments where they emerge. And this further highlights how individual minds, deeply embedded within these very institutions, truly shape the path of disciplines, often pushing them in new directions. The discussions at the workshop, they kind of condensed around particular personalities who were either foundational or really instrumental in shaping Indian anthropology and sociology. We're talking figures like Anantha Krishna Iyer, a pioneering ethnographer from South India, Surajit Sinha, who focused on the anthropology of complex societies, Christoph von Führer-Heimendorf, a European scholar who spent much of his career in India, G.S. Khoury, often called the father of Indian sociology, and A.R. Desai, a prominent Marxist sociologist. These names were central to the discussions.
So a real mix of foundational figures and those who push boundaries.
Exactly. Some, like Khoury, are commonly recognized as foundational, setting the early agenda. Others, like Sinha or Desai, were seen as worth studying because they stretched the discipline in new, perhaps unexpected directions. They pushed theoretical and methodological boundaries beyond the established norms, exploring alternative ways to understand Indian society. And beyond just the individuals, the workshop also meticulously examined the staples of these disciplines. Those core concepts that are routinely studied, analyzed, sometimes redefined. We're talking fundamental topics: caste, tribe, culture, the pervasive idea of the village community, the complex processes of modernization. But crucially, these concepts weren't just analyzed in isolation like detached theoretical constructs. They were rigorously contextualized within the specific, often turbulent historical realities of colonial and post-colonial India.
Right, context is everything.
Absolutely. The discussions explored the inherent tensions between, say, high disciplinary tradition, which might have come from Western frameworks, often carrying colonial baggage, and the powerful imperatives of nation building in a newly independent India. They delved into how sociology or anthropology had either successfully resolved or, maybe more often, failed to resolve these complex, conflicting tensions. Tensions between theoretical purity and the practical demands of a young nation grappling with identity, development, social change. This contextualization is absolutely vital for understanding the unique kind of hybrid trajectory of these fields in India. It shows how local realities forced adaptations, reinterpretations of supposedly universal theories. So the workshop initiated a really crucial, intellectually profound move towards a history and genealogy of these concepts rather than just studying them as, quote, transparent objects.
Transparent objects, meaning take them at face value.
Exactly. It's a significant philosophical shift. Instead of taking concepts like caste or modernization as if their meaning is universally clear, fixed. This approach encourages critical thinking about their origins, their intellectual evolution, and the specific historical, social, political forces that shaped their meaning and application over time. It prompts us to ask probing questions. Who initially defined these concepts? Why were they defined that way at that particular moment? And how has our understanding of society evolved, or perhaps been constrained, through their continuous use and reinterpretation? This kind of rigorous self-reflection is absolutely essential for any mature academic discipline, I think. It helps us see the analytical frameworks we use today not as objective, timeless truth, but as products of their time, subject to reevaluation, reinterpretation, maybe even necessary deconstruction. This then brings up another important question about preserving intellectual life itself. How much of that rich, dynamic intellectual heritage might just get lost over time if we don't consciously preserve it? The source emphasizes a growing awareness among scholars about the pressing need to preserve institutional memory.
Institutional memory, like the collective knowledge within a university department.
Precisely, because, as the piece eloquently argues, many ideas are shaped and sharpened or sometimes destroyed and dulled, not just by formal research and published works, but by the everyday, often informal, interaction of colleagues and students within academic institutions. Those lively debates in hallways, the nuanced discussions in seminars, the fleeting insights shared over coffee, these moments are crucial crucibles for intellectual development. What ultimately gets reflected in formal published work, like academic papers or books, is often only a tiny fraction of that vibrant, dynamic, organic intellectual life. Capturing this informal exchange, these nuanced debates, the subtle shifts in collaborative thought, it's absolutely vital for a complete, authentic understanding of a discipline's history, and for ensuring that valuable insights aren't simply forgotten because they weren't formally written down in a journal. It's about recognizing the profoundly social, human nature of intellectual progress.
You know, you might genuinely wonder why the history of a specific academic discipline, like anthropology or sociology, matters to you, the listener, in your daily life maybe, or understanding current events. But understanding how we came to understand core concepts, like caste or modernization, within the complex Indian context, it isn't just some abstract academic exercise. It actually helps us see their inherent complexities, avoid superficial oversimplification. It compels us to appreciate the hidden intellectual labor, the passionate debates, the profound cultural and political influences behind the knowledge we consume, often just take for granted today. It encourages a deeper, more critical kind of thinking. It prompts us to actively question the very foundations of what we think we know about society, rather than just accepting it passively. It reminds us that even abstract ideas have a tangible history, and that history profoundly shapes their present impact and our ability to analyze social realities effectively. Okay, now let's shift gears quite dramatically. Let's cast our minds back exactly 50 years, to an editorial from June 1975 titled International Affairs, The Price of Petrodollars. This piece really transports us to a crucial, tension-filled moment in the Middle East. It offers a fascinating and sometimes, well, unsettling perspective on superpower dynamics, the burgeoning influence of oil wealth, and the incredibly complex interplay of power, diplomacy, and that fragile pursuit of peace. It's a powerful snapshot of a different era, but one with perhaps striking, maybe even uncomfortable, parallels to the international relations we see today.
Yeah, and it immediately raises an important question about managing global tensions, doesn't it? Particularly between major world powers during that intense period of ideological rivalry. In 1975, the international system was still deeply enmeshed in Cold War dynamics. It could scarcely afford truly antagonistic contradictions to escalate between the two superpowers, the US and the Soviet Union. The stability of the entire global system, as the source points out, depended crucially on these two giants keeping their tensions manageable, preventing them from boiling over into direct conflict. Figures like Henry Kissinger, then U.S. Secretary of State, famous for his shuttle diplomacy, and Andrei Gromyko, the Soviet foreign minister, they were constantly engaged in this delicate, high-stakes diplomatic dance, trying to achieve this precarious balance. And the Middle East at the time was a particular flashpoint, a volatile region constantly threatened to ignite larger superpower confrontations because of its strategic importance, the ongoing Arab-Israeli conflict. It was a place where a local spark could very quickly become a global inferno. What's truly fascinating here, and maybe presents a rather cynical yet perhaps pragmatic interpretation of events, is the source's view of how order was supposedly imposed in the region back then. The editorial suggests the Arab nations needed, first and foremost, an apparently successful war with Israel to restore some of their self-confidence, their pride after previous defeats, particularly the Six-Day War. The October 1973 war, often called the Yom Kippur War, achieved just that psychological victory despite its complex military outcome.
So it was about perception as much as reality.
That's the interpretation here, yes. The moment this objective was achieved, restoring Arab pride, perceived strength, Moscow and Washington, according to this source, jointly performed the last rites of the war. This wasn't about achieving genuine peace through deep reconciliation. While the overjoyed Arabs, having seemingly recovered their own land, or at least their honor, started, quote, shouting hoarse about their victory, Kissinger and Gromyko, operating behind the scenes, silently and decisively brought some semblance of order into the Middle Eastern scene. It implies a carefully orchestrated, almost theatrical sequence of events, designed to achieve a specific, limited outcome for both regional and global players, prioritizing stability over those deeper, unresolved issues.
So, okay, if this was indeed a managed conflict, as the source suggests, how exactly did the superpowers make this rather convenient arrangement palatable to all the regional parties involved, especially after such recent, bitter fighting?
Well, the key, the source argues, was the sudden surge in the new, very attractive prices of oil, what came to be known as the petrodollars.
The money.
The money. And strange as it may seem looking back, the trick appears to have worked quite effectively. The source notes that the old-fashioned, deeply entrenched, anti-imperialist opposition to Israel, to its continued existence in the region, was talked about less and less. It suggests that the immense allure of economic prosperity, enabled by that massive surge in oil revenues flowing into Arab coffers, effectively muted some of the more strident political and ideological objections that had previously fueled the conflict. The promise of wealth, access to global markets, increased development opportunities, it became a powerful, almost irresistible incentive for a profound shift in regional dynamics. It fundamentally altered the calculus of conflict. But this highlights a stark, often uncomfortable reality. The perceived cost of superpower stability often falls disproportionately on vulnerable populations. They get treated like bargaining chips. Even with this new order supposedly in place, the Palestinian Arabs were still largely homeless, dispossessed, lacking a sovereign state. But the powerful figures of the international system, the Kissingers, the Gromykos, they felt a responsibility to, quote, provide for them somewhat. Oh, crucially, in a way that wouldn't disrupt the newly established oil-backed equilibrium.
Manage the problem, not solve it.
That seems to be the implication. Quite understandably, for that reason, the Palestine Liberation Organization, the PLO, and its strong-headed leaders who had previously engaged in armed struggle, they would have to behave. They would have to be tamed, brought into the international fold, stripped of their radical edge. The first steps in this direction had already been taken. Notably with Yasser Arafat, the then charismatic leader of the PLO, having already addressed the UN General Assembly in 1974. The hope, according to the source's cynical interpretation, was that he would learn the benefits of being a respectable, modern, UN-addressing statesman, rather than remaining the ever-agile, rugged guerrilla leader he had been. This shows a clear, calculated effort to co-opt, to integrate perceived threats into the existing international order, neutralizing their more revolutionary elements through diplomatic engagement and, well, implicit incentives. The broader context for this period of supposed superpower stability in the Middle East was the symbolic and economically significant reopening of the Suez Canal in June 1975. That happened against this delicate diplomatic backdrop. According to the source, superpower dominance in the Middle East was, quote, never more stable than it is today, referring to that moment in 1975. This stability, however, came with conditions. Israel would continue to prosper, its security seemingly guaranteed, and Zionism, the movement for Jewish self-determination in the ancestral Jewish homeland, would still be alive and kicking as a political force. But then the editorial poses a provocative question. It suggests that the radical and pragmatic Arabs alike might argue that the stability, the continued existence of Israel, were simply a small price to pay for the petrodollars. Small price? Wow. Yeah. The piece then asks, almost mockingly, what is radicalism if not petrodollars and a little rhetoric? This is a profoundly cynical, jarring question. It implies that even deeply held ideological positions, national aspirations, revolutionary fervor could be diluted, reshaped, maybe even bought off by overwhelming economic incentives, reducing genuine political struggle to mere performative rhetoric once financial gains were secured. It really strips away idealism to expose a raw transactional power dynamic. And this provocative stance immediately raises an important question about the very nature of international power, how it seeks to legitimize itself, often through carefully crafted narratives. The source asserts it's not entirely fair to maintain that only Anwar Sadat, the then president of Egypt, would argue in this pragmatic, petrodollar-driven way. The beauty of the international system at the time, it argues, with a heavy dose of irony, was that it was successfully putting across a compelling theory that it was very much like modern capitalism, world dominance with a human face.
World dominance with a human face.
Right. A narrative suggesting that global power, though still undeniably dominant, hierarchical, was somehow benign, reasonable, even ultimately beneficial for everyone involved. It implied a system where economic integration, growth, could supersede ideological conflicts, historical grievances, leading to a more prosperous, stable world order. And many third-world politicians grappling with immense challenges, post-colonial nation-building, economic underdevelopment, Cold War pressures were, according to the source, genuinely buying into that theory. Sadat, at least, had the practical, immediate advantage of being directly paid for his acceptance through that influx of petrodollars. It was, from this perspective, framed as a decent and sensible business deal, where he seemingly had to, quote, count his petrodollars before he can address himself to more abstract problems, such as imperialism and Zionism in the Middle East. It paints a vivid picture of a deeply transactional international order, where economic pragmatism could, and often did, supersede historical grievances and ideological commitments, at least in the eyes of the dominant powers and certain regional leaders.
This historical deep dive into the Middle East of 1975, viewed through this lens of the price of petrodollars, it provides a powerfully disquieting yet incredibly relevant framework, doesn't it, for viewing current events. It forces you to critically consider how immense economic incentives, the relentless pursuit of perceived geopolitical stability, can profoundly shape long-standing conflicts, how they can dramatically influence the choices of leadership and ultimately redefine the very meaning of terms like radicalism or peace or justice on the global stage. Are there echoes of this precise transactional approach in contemporary international relations? You have to wonder, do we still see economic or strategic geopolitical benefits being prioritized over what might be considered fundamental principles, human rights, long-term equitable solutions? It really challenges us to look beyond the rhetoric, understand the often brutal underlying drivers of global decision-making, both then and now. Okay, so we just looked at the Middle East through a 1975 lens.
We saw how powerful economic and political forces shaped its dynamics, with that rather cynical view of Techschillers enabling world dominance with the human face. Let's pivot sharply to the present, to June 2025. And a stark, harrowing account of the ongoing crisis in Gaza, titled Weaponized Starvation in Gaza. This piece, it pulls no punches. It starts with the chilling incident that immediately underscores the devastating severity, the deeply concerning nature of the situation unfolding right now.
Yeah, what's profoundly unsettling here is the immediacy, the graphic nature of the reporting. It brings us straight into a deeply concerning incident that really highlights the extreme measures being taken. On Monday, June 9th, 2025, Israeli forces boarded the Madeleine. This was an aid ship trying to break the siege imposed by Israel on Gaza since March 2nd. And this boarding occurred unequivocally in international law. Right, which the source explicitly states was an illegal act by Israel, as it doesn't hold territorial sovereignty beyond its recognized borders. The crew activists, journalists, including one member of the European Parliament, were reportedly forced to throw their phones overboard. A deliberate act, presumably to prevent documentation. And they were subsequently detained, their whereabouts initially unknown. This incident didn't just bring renewed international attention to the Israeli blockade of Gaza, a blockade enforced through the systematic denial of aid and essential supplies. It also starkly highlighted the extent to which Israel is prepared to go, even resorting to actions in international waters, to ensure a complete, total blockade of Gaza, effectively sealing off the strip from any external help.
The core argument presented in this piece is, well, profoundly disturbing, and it uses language that is intentionally strong, unflinching. The ongoing situation in Gaza is described not merely as a humanitarian crisis, it's explicitly called a genocide, where starvation has been deliberately and systematically weaponized.
Weaponized starvation.
Yes, the source contends that through this systematic, continuous denial of food, clean water, vital medicine, other essential supplies, conditions are being actively created for the annihilation of the Palestinian people in Gaza. Furthermore, it connects this devastating humanitarian catastrophe directly to a larger Israeli project to annex Gaza, a long-held ambition among certain Israeli factions, and a broader movement towards the creation of Greater Israel through what it terms ethnic cleansing. And just to be clear, the source defines this as the systematic forced removal or killing of an ethnic or religious group from a territory by a more powerful group, often aiming to create an ethnically homogeneous area. These are exceptionally grave allegations. They paint a chilling picture of calculated destruction and demographic transformation.
And this immediately raises an important question about the deliberate subversion of fundamental humanitarian principles designed to protect civilians in conflict zones. A new and particularly ghastly tactic in what the source calls this ghastly saga of inhumanity has been the direct weaponization of aid itself.
Weaponizing aid, how does that work?
Well, aid distribution in Gaza reportedly restarted on May 26 through a newly established entity, the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, or GHF. It's a U.S.-based organization founded notably only in 2025. Its modus operandi, its method of operation, is explicitly described as being at complete odds with established international humanitarian principles. And, according to the source, it has been universally condemned by the UN and other respected international humanitarian organizations like Doctors Without Borders. The methods employed by GHF are detailed and deeply concerning. They include conditional distribution of aid, where access is tied to specific, often restrictive, criteria, systemic exclusion of certain populations or areas, which exacerbates disparities, and critically, the direct placement of Israeli military personnel in charge of aid distribution centers. These practices, as described by the source, effectively allow aid to be manipulated, used as a tool of control, surveillance, collective punishment, rather than simply as an impartial means of relief. It transforms humanitarian assistance into another grim element of the conflict itself. What's truly harrowing here, and gives a visceral sense of the crisis, are the vivid, almost apocalyptic scenes described from GHF-operated aid distribution centers, particularly in Rafah. The source paints a devastating picture. Thousands of desperate civilians funneled together into chaotic, unsafe spaces. Aid packages literally hurled towards them from trucks, rather than distributed in an orderly, dignified way.
Hurled at them.
That's the description. This undignified method is described as a deliberate attempt to dehumanize the Palestinians and rob them of their dignity, reducing them to a desperate scramble for basic survival. Even more horrifying, since the GHF began its operations, massacres of aid seekers have reportedly become an everyday occurrence, with Israeli forces allegedly opening fire on the crowds that assembled just to seek essential supplies. More than 200 people are stated to have been killed in these horrific massacres in just the past 2 weeks alone.
200 people, just seeking aid.
Yes. Incidents that chillingly harken back to the widely condemned Flower Massacre of February 29, 2024, where over 100 people were killed while seeking food aid. The source notes a familiar script that follows such atrocities, characterized first by immediate justifications from the Israeli side, often citing self-defense, and then by the eventual normalization of these horrors by the international community, whether it's bombing civilian infrastructure, targeting hospitals, healthcare professionals, or firing upon civilians merely trying to survive. This script, the source argues, continues to play out to a complicit silence of nations and institutions, a silence that effectively enables these actions.
The source is remarkably direct, unsparing about international involvement, too. It lays out a clear accusation of complicity that extends far beyond direct engagement. It states that powerful nations, the U.S., the U.K., Germany, others are seen as directly complicit in what it terms the ongoing genocide, through their unwavering financial and military support to Israel, providing the material means for the conflict. But the indictment doesn't stop there. Many other nations, while not providing direct material support, are implicated, according to the source, through their silence.
Complicity through silence.
Yes, it suggests that inaction or a failure to forcefully condemn and intervene in the face of such events is itself a profound form of complicity, morally weighing heavily on the global community and fundamentally undermining the principles of international law.
And this situation immediately raises an important, deeply troubling question about where true moral responsibility ultimately lies, especially when national governments appear to falter in upholding international norms, humanitarian principles. While brave citizens, like the crew of the Madeleine aid ship, many still in Israeli detention, have actively attempted to break the siege on Gaza at immense personal risk. The actions of many governments, according to the source, do not seem primarily concerned with upholding international humanitarian principles, conventions against genocide. Furthermore, as thousands of protesters plan to join the global March to Gaza, a significant grassroots initiative to march to the Rafah crossing at the Egypt-Israel border to break the siege, even Egyptian authorities have reportedly started to detain and deport activists as they arrive in Egypt, seemingly in deference to existing political arrangements.
Deference to Israeli interests, the source calls it.
Yes, and this deference, the source argues, unveils systemic geopolitical causes that have not only enabled the ongoing live-streamed genocide, but have, in fact, created conditions for its very inevitability. The territorial expansion of Israel, seen through relentless settlement growth and the consolidation of U.S. hegemony-dominant influence in West Asia, are explicitly identified as the leading factors contributing to the current situation of unabated genocide and ethnic cleansing. The continued ethnic cleansing of Palestinians in the West Bank through settlement expansion, detention, extrajudicial killings further exposes what the source describes as the hollowness of Israeli claims regarding temporary security measures, revealing a more permanent, expansive agenda. What's particularly striking here, and represents a really significant shift in global diplomacy, is the notable change in U.S. policy concerning the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. For decades, the U.S. has publicly backed a two-state solution, advocating for an independent Palestinian state alongside Israel as the path to lasting peace. However, the source indicates there are now clear, undeniable signs that the Donald Trump-led U.S. government may be actively deviating from this long-standing course.
A major policy shift.
It appears so. A UN conference, scheduled from June 17th to 20th, co-hosted by France and Saudi Arabia, was set to deliberate on a ceasefire, a permanent solution, potentially re-emphasizing a two-state approach. In a striking, assertive response, a U.S. diplomatic démarche, that's a formal, often forceful diplomatic protest or request to another government, was sent on Juneteenth. This démarche explicitly discouraged nations from attending this crucial conference. It noted that anti-Israel actions, such as recognizing a Palestinian state, would be seen as directly opposing U.S. foreign policy interests and would invite unspecified consequences.
Wow, that's blunt.
Very blunt. And echoing these sentiments with stark clarity on the very same day, the U.S. ambassador to Israel stated unequivocally that an independent Palestinian state was no longer a U.S. foreign policy goal. The source posits that a two-state solution simply cannot coexist with the vision of a greater Israel, a concept encompassing expanded Israeli territorial control. This abandonment of the two-state solution, coupled with the ongoing ethnic cleansing operations described in the West Bank and Gaza, powerfully reinforces this grim reality, making a diplomatic resolution seem even more remote. And this unfolding situation raises a profoundly important question about the state of international solidarity, moral responsibility in the face of such profound human suffering. On Friday, June 13th, the UN General Assembly adopted a resolution. By a substantial majority, 149 votes against 12. This resolution was unequivocal. It demanded an immediate, unconditional, permanent ceasefire. Furthermore, it explicitly condemned the use of starvation as a weapon, a direct reference to Gaza, and demanded Israel immediately lift the blockade to allow aid to flow unimpeded.
A clear message from the UNGA.
Overwhelmingly clear. Predictably, the U.S. and Israel voted against it, aligning themselves against that international consensus. However, what the source highlights as particularly significant and concerning is India's abstention from the vote. The source describes this as abdicating its moral responsibility, arguing that the foundational principles of the Indian Republic, which historically stand resolutely against colonialism, apartheid, genocide, do not allow for such moral vacillation on these critical questions. This abstention, the source contends, vitiates against India's long, proud history of anti-colonial solidarity, particularly with the Palestinian cause, and suggests a troubling shift in its foreign policy priorities.
The source concludes this harrowing account with a powerful, direct call to action, reminding us that as governments across the globe continue to abandon their responsibility to humanitarian principles, international law, citizens must continue to raise their voices, demand accountability against the ongoing genocide. This account forces you, our listener, to confront the grim realities of modern conflict, to grapple with the fragility of international law, and to truly comprehend the profound, often devastating impact of global politics on human lives. It leaves you wondering, in a world where such atrocities are not hidden but are, as the source states, live-streamed, what role do you play? In witnessing and responding to such events, what is the ultimate responsibility of the individual when institutions, when nations, appear to fail their most basic moral obligations? We've just navigated through a truly diverse and often challenging landscape of insights today. For the detailed analysis of global food production, the nuanced history of how academic disciplines evolved in India, talk to the complex and at times stark, brutal realities of international geopolitics spanning the seemingly distant past of 1975 to the raw immediacy of June 2025. This deep dive into just a single publication's different pieces truly underscores how much valuable knowledge lies within our grasp, and how quickly you can become well-informed on a vast array of topics, even when they seem unrelated at first glance. They are, in fact, often deeply interconnected, revealing these broader patterns.
Absolutely. And if we connect this to the bigger picture, particularly that stark contrast between the 1975 assessment world dominance with a human face, where economic leverage like petrodollars smoothed over conflicts, and the 2025 narrative of live-streamed genocide and moral abdication by nations, it raises an incredibly important and frankly unsettling question. In what fundamental ways do global economic forces and geopolitical power dynamics, both then and now, fundamentally shape the choices of nations? How do they redefine the parameters of what is considered acceptable? And perhaps even twist the very definition of peace and justice within the international system? Does economic leverage ultimately dictate humanitarian outcomes? Or can collective moral conviction ever truly override such powerful drivers?
We encourage you to keep asking those big, difficult questions, connecting the dots between seemingly disparate events, because that's where true understanding really begins. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive.